Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another live stream here at Empty Cloud Monastery. This is coming to you live from West Orange, New Jersey on Friday morning. And so whether you're watching this live, I see some people already joining in and leaving some comments, or if you're watching this later on after it's been recorded, I hope that you're doing well. And this is going to be a follow-up from our previous discussion. We had a live stream on Wednesday night where we discussed the Cūḷasuññatasutta, the shorter discourse on emptiness. And this was broken up into two parts. So today we're going to be continuing on with that and looking at the second part, finishing off this discourse. And you might see on the channel that we also have scheduled a guided meditation on this, based off this discourse. So we have a long, and then there's even the Mahasuññatasutta. There's the greater discourse on emptiness, which we might do, and that might be two parts. And there are others as well. So we can kind of continue with this theme of emptiness. And there's a lot to say, but we'll try to be relatively brief this morning. So I will render homage to the Buddha 3 times in the traditional manner, and then we can go ahead and get started looking at our sutta. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Sanghaṃ Saranang Gacchāmi. Okay, so hello to some of the people joining in. Hello to Mr. Avi and Yadav, Sean, Hasa Campagna, Isael, and Gregory, and anyone else joining in live. So a brief recap, a brief review of what we covered. So we were in Majjhima Nikaya 121, and we had Ananda telling the Buddha that he had heard him say that he often abided in meditation on emptiness. And he asked, did he remember that well? Did he learn that properly? Which is actually sometimes comes up, because remember, in the time of the Buddha, you'd have to remember what was said, right? And so remembering what was said and reciting it and so on is very important. So when you hear someone, you remember something, then Ananda is asking, did I remember that properly? Because he might be reciting it. So traditionally, the story is that at the first council after the Buddha's passing away, they held a council where they gathered together and they recited the Vinaya, the rules, and they recited the suttas, the discourses. And it's traditionally said that Ananda was the one who was questioned on the suttas. So you had Upali, who was questioned on the Vinaya, and they asked, basically going down the list, what was the first rule, what is the second rule, and so on. And then Ananda was questioned on the suttas. Ananda being the Buddha's attendant for most of the latter part of his life, meaning, he would massage the Buddha, he would fan the Buddha, he would bring his bowl and help him with his robes, he would help set up his seat and help manage his guests and so on. So what we call the upatak. And so Ananda was his attendant, meaning that he spent a lot of time with him. When you're the attendant, part of the benefits of being an attendant monk is that you spend a lot of time with the monk in question. So some monks, actually a major part of their practice is attending, right? So some people, they might think, when you become a monk, I guess they might think that you're like all the time meditating. But actually that is not the case. It depends on the type of monk you are and where you are. And some monks, they actually spend a lot of time attending on seniors, because it cultivates a sense of care and you listen to them, you can ask questions. So you can get very close. So Ananda, that's the kind of the setting, right? Ananda is, he is not able to pull up on Sutta Central what the Buddha said. He has to remember it. And so he's asking, is this right? And then he's asking the Buddha to explain it. So he's giving the Buddha an opportunity to teach further, right? And then the Buddha explained a little bit, what does it mean to abide in emptiness meditation, right? He gave a kind of explanation of that. And so he started by saying, we imagine, look at the room that you're in and see that it is empty of certain things, right? And you can meditate on that emptiness. You can meditate on the fact that the room that you're in, the place that you're in, it's empty of certain more coarse things. It's empty of certain disturbances, right? And we talked a lot about how actually whenever we find peace, we're noticing that it's empty of something more coarse, right? And this can help you find peace, right? If you're not feeling peaceful, it can help you notice, like, well, what am I taking for granted? What is this not? What is this not? What is not disturbing here? And then he goes on. So that is the core, right? We discussed that. That's the core of the emptiness practice. The core of emptiness, at least the principle which is guiding the meditation, is you have to notice what is currently empty. What is your experience empty of? And then you notice what is present. What is the oneness there? What is the presence there? And then you notice that it's not empty of that present thing, right? So the room is empty of elephants and cows, empty of loud buses and cars, but it's not empty of, say, a person speaking, right? So it is relatively quiet. It's empty of the loud noises, but it's not empty of all noise. And then you notice that. And then the next step is you try to find a perception which is more empty than that. So empty out the oneness that you find there, right? And so that's the practice, right? The practice is of finding peace in emptiness, but then noticing that that emptiness is still relative. It's not complete. It's not 100% empty, right? And I'll just say a few words on this because I feel that there's so much to say that I can add a little bit on what are we talking about, contextualizing this in terms of also in most of the time when we hear the word emptiness, right? Shunyata or sunyata or kong, right? Or something like that. Then we're thinking of the characteristic of emptiness, right? Like the 5 aggregates, the 5 skandhas or 5 khandhas, those are empty. Or we're thinking of anatta, non-self, right? So how does this relate to that? Well, actually there is a, if anyone has ever practiced Zen, or in China, it's in Mandarin, it's called Chan, right? So Chan or Zen, there's a type of meditation there, which is like in Zen, they call it shikantaza, right? Shikantaza means just sitting, just mind sitting. And in China, there's also a phrase for that, but maybe you might know it as like mocha, or also I think, forgive my pronunciation, but there's also one called 中道是相观, 是相观. Okay, so that's contemplation of the middle way reality in my poor Chinese. So those types of meditations, so this thing of like just sitting or silent illumination or contemplating the middle way. So what is that referring to? That is actually referring to basically a kind of emptiness meditation. So this is where they come together. So this sutta is the Buddha's explanation of, it's related to the characteristic of emptiness, because this is how you can gradually meditate to realize emptiness. Of course, all Buddhist meditation properly, implemented, the end goal will be to realize emptiness, right? That's the end goal. But this is like the Buddha, there's a particular way you can meditate on emptiness where you're focusing on that, right? So yes, you might realize emptiness by meditating on the breath, but that's not the main theme of the meditation. But in this way of meditating, you're actually, from the beginning, you're taking emptiness as the theme, as the inspiring factor, which is guiding the meditation, right? So what is the point of, of noticing like, oh, the room is empty of elephants and so on? What's the point of that? Where is this going, right? Well, the idea is that our mind, it grasps on to particular things, right? It grasps on, and it perceives things as solid. It doesn't let go. So it settles down. It fixates on things. And what you're trying to do in this practice is you're trying to allow it to relinquish that fixation, right? So the kind of Zen, the Mahayana practices that I mentioned, they are very much within how should I say it? They're in a historical context. Like, it's always helpful to look at the historical context, where they are basically what we would consider supposed to be instantaneous practices. So like the Zen practice or the Chan practice, they are based off, other practices in Chinese Buddhism, right? They didn't just arise out of nowhere, right? They are dependently originated. And so they come out of a system based also off like Tiantai and other Chinese philosophical systems, where they classify types of meditation. So I'm saying this because this will then help us talk about this sutta. So the way that they classify meditation, for example, is cultivating samatha, cultivating tranquility gradually, and then cultivating insight, or cultivating insight gradually to develop more tranquility, and then realize more insight, or cultivating tranquility and insight together gradually, or cultivating tranquility and insight together instantaneously. So you might be familiar with a Pali Sutta. There's a Pali Sutta called the Yuganadha Sutta, where Ananda says, he says that whenever someone realizes arahantship, whenever someone becomes awakened, they do it in one of four ways. Either they cultivate tranquility and then insight, or they cultivate some insight and then develop further tranquility based off that, or they develop tranquility and insight together. And then there's a fourth one, which we don't need to go into here. So what he's saying there is that some people, their mind will incline towards tranquility. Like their mind will incline towards maybe just they have a very easy time just finding peace in meditation. And they just find a lot of peace, a lot of tranquility. But they don't necessarily have a very natural inclination towards wisdom, towards investigation, right? So it's like some people, they might be able to sit and be very calm, but they don't really understand the nature of their mind. Like they can become very peaceful, but they need a lot of instruction on Buddhist principles, on Buddhist wisdom to then investigate deeper. And it might take them some time. But when they do investigate, it'll be very powerful because their mind will be very powerful. It'll be very, very peaceful. And it'll be very clear. So they'll be able to see clearly. It's just that sometimes, tranquility of mind, it goes together with clarity of mind. But some people, they have an inclination towards tranquility. They have to learn how to direct their mind towards the clarity, towards understanding. Their mind will just naturally incline towards the tranquility. So it's not to demonize, it's very important not to develop like a strong dichotomy between tranquility and insight. They go together. But it's just that some people, their mind will incline towards focusing on the calming aspect. Other people, their mind will incline towards investigation. So you might be one of these two, right? Your mind might incline toward investigation. That means that, when you hear about impermanence and you hear about, observing impermanence, you find that, really interesting and you just want to meditate on it. You find it really cool, but you don't find it natural to develop calm, to develop stillness. Or you hear about, non-self, and you find that very interesting and you can sit down and meditate on that for a long time, but you can't, necessarily enter like a very peaceful, still meditation. So your mind inclines towards investigation. Or you might incline towards investigating some other principle, right? So some people, their mind inclines towards that. So they might actually develop, like at the beginning of the practice, they might develop a lot of wisdom, a lot of, you'd say, investigative wisdom and discernment, but they don't really have their mind is not powerful enough. It's not like still enough to have a deep, to realize arahantship. So some people, it'll go either way. So if you develop a lot of tranquility, then you can eventually, it'll be very easy when you get the right instructions. Someone points out what to do, you can see clearly. Other people, they'll develop a lot of investigation, and through that investigation, they will let go of some of their attachments and they will develop more tranquility. And then it'll be enough because they'll already have the wisdom. So then once their mind develops more tranquility, it'll just naturally understand. Like it'll naturally be inclining towards understanding once it sinks down in that tranquility. So it's either kind of one of the two. Then the other one, the third one, is developing them together, yoked together in unison. So like simultaneously, basically. And this meditation, this emptiness meditation, is a form of that. Okay, so this is a form of meditation where you are developing, you're supposed to be developing tranquility and insight together, right? So notice at each step of the way, the Buddha has you develop insight into some emptiness. And then he has you, how it says, their mind leaps forth, gains confidence, settles down, and becomes decided. So your mind becomes faithful, stable, secure, fixed on that perception. So you use a little bit of insight into emptiness to develop tranquility. Then later on, when the time is appropriate, then you reflect on the lack of emptiness in that perception. And then you use that insight to develop more tranquility. You see, so it's going back and forth like that. So for example, you perceive the emptiness of the room, and that's a kind of insight, that's an investigation. Then you fix your mind on that perception, and your mind can become very peaceful. And then you use your insight to see, but this peacefulness is also relative. And then you develop a more calm perception, and you develop tranquility. And then you realize that tranquility is also relative. So you're using your insight to develop peace. And then from the perspective of peace, you use it to develop more insight into emptiness, right? So the kind of Zen sort of meditation, those are based off a way of thinking where they're supposed to be like instantaneous, meaning that instantaneously you just let go of everything. Instantaneously you realize emptiness. Instantaneously your mind develops tranquility and insight in one moment. But realistically, that's not how it goes, right? That's not how, most people, they will actually have to, they're not going to instantaneously realize those things. So this is actually more like a description of the gradual union of calm and insight. This is a description of, if you're meditating on emptiness, this is how the Buddha says it can go. So realistically, when you sit down to meditate, your mind is not going to relinquish everything at once. So instead, what you do is you relinquish bits by bits. You're unhooking your mind. You are opening and expanding your mind to become more spacious, to become less established. So usually our mind fixates and it gets established, right? It develops a border of like who we are and what we're experiencing. And that's where desire and aversion can arise, right? But as you melt those barriers and you kind of melt your mind and you expand your mind, it becomes less fixated, less established. And so things become more open. So like a cloud, right? So imagine you see a cloud and it seems very solid, seems very fixed. But if you look at it long enough, actually you'll notice the cloud shifts and it changes and it melts and it doesn't have a fixed form. So when you see that, you might then become detached from the idea of like, oh, this cloud is like that. Actually, it doesn't have a fixed nature, right? The cloud, it just, depending on certain conditions, it'll take a certain shape, but the cloud isn't actually a certain way. Like it's not fixed a certain way, right? It's never stable. So this meditation, it can lead you to seeing that, right? We tend to think, well, I am stable, that I am stable and I'm kind of, everything else might be changing or certain things might be changing, but my house, my body, my life, the people I love, they're kind of relatively stable. But actually they're not, they're not stable. Actually, everything is like the cloud. Everything is unstable. Everything can melt. Everything can shift. And so you're using this meditation to relinquish your mind and let go. Okay, so that will then be helpful as we go on to the more rarefied descriptions that the Buddha is giving. So you're developing simultaneous tranquility and insight, gradually deepening those two qualities together to realize more and more relinquishment, to let the mind detach more and more, for the mind to become more and more spacious, more and more empty, until eventually the supreme emptiness, which we will touch on. Okay. So then, just recapping, you go from perceiving the empty room to just an empty environment. So the Buddha has them perceive just the forest. So their field of awareness, their field of perception becomes just forest, just wilderness. And then they reflect that, okay, that's empty of what came before, the forest, that field of awareness, it's empty, right? You say, oh, it's so peaceful, so empty. Yes, it is, but it's not empty of forest. So then the Buddha has them focus on earth. So finding just an element within the forest, a more simple thing in the forest. So how do you do this, right? What does he say? You actually don't need to establish your mind per se. You are actually stepping back further, right? So he says, how do they do this? They ignore the hilly terrain, the riverlands, the stumps and thorns, the rugged mountains, and they just establish their mind in the perception of earth. So how do you do that, right? So let's say you're perceiving the forest. You can then relinquish the grips of your mind, like unhook your mind even further, empty out your mind even further by just not establishing it, not getting fixated on the on the diversity of the forest. So you unhook your mind and you will just be left with like a blank slate of earth. So you're emptying it out. Like you're not kind of trying to concoct or fabricate or construct something more complex. You're actually just letting go of some degree of fabricating, of the mind creating experience. So again, like every step of the way, our mind is constantly creating and constructing our experience of the world, right? So this is a meditation where you're letting go of that process of constructing, the process of fabricating, the process of creating and concocting experience, and you're relinquishing that step by step to allow the mind to rest more and more in its natural state, basically, which you'll find out, at the end, it actually doesn't have a natural state. Every experience of the mind is constructed. So you go step by step to relinquish the construction of the mind. Okay, so how does this work? You're perceiving, if you are, you perceive maybe just forest. Now that perception, you've built it, right? You've constructed it by focusing your mind on it. So now relinquish the grips of your mind, relinquish the constructing of the mind. And what will be left, if you relinquish just to a certain degree, not fully, if you relinquish fully, you would realize emptiness, but you relinquish just a little bit and it's just earth. So the diversity of the stumps and the trees and the hills, that passes away because it requires effort for the mind to construct that differentiation. So instead, you just experience the simplicity of the earth element, which is like the through line, the continuity of that experience, right? So you are relinquishing that constructive quality of the mind. Okay, so then you get established in that, but then you reflect eventually that, okay, that is very empty, right? It seems very simple, very unconcocted, right? So think about, like, just to understand my speech, right? Your mind has to do a lot of activity. It is engaging in the sounds and creating meaning out of the sounds. And you also, a lot of times with our day, we're creating a sense of identity, we're creating a sense of others, we're creating a sense of likes and dislikes. We are focusing on different objects and perceptions and memories and thoughts. So our mind is very active, right? It's doing a lot of activity. Now here, you are emptying that out. So just focusing on simple perceptions and then emptying out even the activity of maintaining a simple perception like forest. So now you reflect, okay, it's very empty, very peaceful. And if you're experiencing just earth, just a simple element, but empty that, can you step back even further? Can you apply the experience of what it's like to reflect on relative emptiness when the mind relinquishes something more coarse? Can you unhook your mind? Can you detach and expand? Can you extend your mind out, rest it into an even more relaxed state without focusing on earth? Okay. So I would really stress, how are you supposed to do this practice? You're not actually forcing your mind, but you're supposed to allow your mind to imagine that your mind is kind of held in place and you're taking out the hooks. So you're allowing your mind to suspend itself even more naturally. So naturally your mind functions, right? You don't actually, even if we're not craving and so on, the mind, how would I say it? The mind is operating without us needing to say do this, do that, right? When the cause and conditions are there, the mind operates. So the mind has this naturally relaxed character. So, but we tend to get very tense and we kind of fixate and we narrow the mind and we establish the mind down. So what you do to do this meditation is you're actually just trying to relinquish that fixity of the mind. Just allow the mind to become more natural, less controlled, less fabricated, less artificially held in place, and just open it up. So it's almost, you should just allow it to be it's dropping into a more subtle state. So it's becoming more empty, right? It's becoming more, less fixated on characteristics, less fixated on identifying marks. Okay, so then you have the earth. Then you empty that out, as I said, and then the Buddha has you go to the perception of the dimension of infinite space. And as we talked about, this is where we left off last time, more or less. And as we talked about, there can be two ways of taking this. One way of taking it is as the deep, that the Buddha is saying that, at this point, someone should be developing the attainment, the akasananchayatana samapatti. So that's a very deep attainment. So like most people, they'll never experience that. And actually some arahants don't even experience that. So, so in order to make it more practical, there's another way of doing this, which is that, as I mentioned, you can actually take the perception, the theme of infinite space, as your meditation object, quote unquote. I don't like the word meditation object, but as your meditation theme. So just like you can meditate on the breath, right? So like as you settle down, if you just sit down in meditation and just let your mind just let go of the attachment to past and future and thoughts and so on, naturally your breath might arise. Because naturally the mind, when it's less fixated and focused, it becomes more aware of a natural state. Naturally, just your body is breathing. So it's more natural. It's more empty in that way. Now, what happens if so that's the theme of your meditation, is the breath. So what happens if you are focusing on a solid perception of an element and you relinquish that even further? Well, all elements, all materiality, all form, all rupa occurs within space. It's within space, boundless space, right? So this is a perception. It's not, necessarily, you don't have to think of it as like a reality claim, but just that can be an experience of it, right? That your body takes up space. It's occurring within space, and space doesn't actually have a boundary. So you can just like melt your body, melt your experience of the earth, melt your experience of materiality, and just unhook the mind, which fabricates, creates, concocts, and focuses on materiality. Just unhook that, and more naturally, like base level, will be an experience of just space, right? That's below the experience of materiality. So you can do that without attaining, without attaining that sphere, because it's just a perception. It's just it's more of an exercise in relinquishing the attachments of the mind, but it's not going to be fully there. Now, if you did fully get absorbed in that, you would actually attain this, you would attain the attainment of infinite space. But you don't really need to be concerned about that. What you should be concerned about is how fixed is your mind, right? Just focus on relinquishing the fixation of the mind. And then whatever arises, that's okay. You just let it be, because we're actually concerned with letting go, not with, more characteristics arising. So if you develop the perception of materiality, of solid, earth, can you unhook your mind? Can you allow your mind to melt and sink into a more base level, a more ground level of just space? Can you have a mind like space? And there's other places where the Buddha actually recommends to, for example, his son, Rahula, he recommends, Rahula, cultivate a mind like space. Just as space is not established, it's not fixated anywhere, so to cultivate a mind like space, so that pleasant and unpleasant contacts, sensory experiences don't obsess your mind. So what does that mean? As you go about your day, can you cultivate a mind like space? Can you step back from the features of your experience, not getting kind of zooming in on the features? Can you step back and just focus on the perception that it's all occurring in space? Can you do that? And you can do that. And you will find peace. So like, for example, say someone is, and this is actually an example from the sutta, say someone is like abusing you, verbally assaulting you with their words. Usually we get very fixated on the words, right? Like the emotions of the words. But actually the Buddha says, if you allow your mind to be like space, you realize actually none of it's personal. Like it's just a bunch of elements occurring within space. But your mind will be at the level of space. So it will be below the occurrence of the elements. So it won't be bothered by those things, right? So like if your mind is perceiving, if it's not focusing on the characteristic of the materiality, but just the space, then like whatever happens on the level of the elements will not be disturbing to your mind. So just like the Buddha also says at one point, like if someone tries to write on space, they can't do it. And also space is not bothered. Like air passes through space, trash passes through space. There's all kinds of things in space. The space is not bothered. So your mind, if your mind is like space, your mind will not be bothered by everything which is more coarse than space, right? Because that's the base level of your mind, would be space. So, like, for example, if you're experiencing bodily pains, can you notice like all the pains in your body, they're actually occurring in space? And your mind can go to a more ground level, a base level of space, dropping the more coarse perception of the body and the pains, and then you won't be disturbed. Your mind will be like space. And even as you go about your day, even when you're not in meditation, trying to cultivate a calm, stable perception of just space, you can actually try to perceive that. Like, allow your mind to just rest in that background awareness of just space, and you'll be less pushed and pulled by things. And you can also do this, cultivating it like just as you're developing your mindfulness. Can you develop mindfulness of space? Right? So like right now, you might be focusing on the vision of me, or the voice, the sounds, or something going on internally. Can you notice that at the same time, there's also space in your experience? Can you notice the space and allow your mind to go into that? So you will still hear, sounds. You'll still see sights. Your ears and your eyes will still function, but your mind will not be established on them. If you then sit down and you do this practice, your ears might actually stop functioning because your mind might become established in the perception space. But if you just do it through your daily life, your ears and eyes can still work. So for example, the Buddha, his mind, any arahant, their mind is not established on anything, including space, but on anything. But they still have eyes, they still have ears, they still function as long as their body is functioning, right? So yes, the Buddha can meditate on emptiness, and he can kind of just, he can drop everything. But when he's not meditating, he can also function. He can speak and hear and listen and talk and smell and taste and so on. So in the same way, you can meditate on space and just try to cultivate a mind which is just at the perception of space. Or as you go throughout your day, you can allow the space to be like the base level of your mind while the other things are still functioning, right? And that can find a little peace. Okay, so that's space. Then he has the person go to, they reflect that field of awareness, that field of perception is empty of the perception of earth. It's empty of the perception of wilderness. It's empty of the perception of earth. But there is that lack of emptiness, namely the oneness dependent on the perception of the dimension of infinite space. And so they regard it as empty of what is not there. But as to what remains, they understand that it is present. That's how emptiness manifests in them, genuine, undistorted, and pure. So you notice the space, right? Then you might find, that's very peaceful to abide in that perception of space, both in meditation and outside of meditation. You might find, that's very peaceful. But then you have to meditate on emptiness, and you have to see, that is not empty though of space. The mind is still established at a base level of space. So then you move on. What happens if you unhook your mind? What if you unestablish your mind from space? Like, what is left at that point if you just go one step? So one thing that's worth mentioning is that every time you reflect on emptiness and you unhook from the more coarse oneness, your mind could actually enter supreme emptiness. You could actually let go of everything. But more commonly, you will just let go of a little bit. So you'll just go to the next level, right? This is kind of going back to what I said with like the instantaneous samatha vipassana, right? If you really meditate on the principle of emptiness, you let go of everything at once. But most of the time, you're gonna find like a little bit of emptiness, and you're gonna drop your mind. You're gonna unhook your mind a little bit, and then you're gonna melt it a little bit more, and then you're gonna relinquish a little bit more. So it's gonna be gradual. It's not gonna be instantaneous. So when you move from space, if you don't relinquish everything, then what will be left? What's the next step? Well, everything material is occurring within space, right? But what is the space occurring within? It's recurring within the field of your awareness. It's recurring within awareness. So even the space, actually beyond the space, is just the awareness of the space. It's just the knowing. So even space, you might think again, like, space, this is the most empty it can get. No, actually space is also occurring within awareness. So space is also still an establishment of the mind. So then the Buddha says that someone can focus on the perception of the dimension of infinite consciousness. And they understand that their field of perception is empty of the perception of earth, and it's empty of the perception of the dimension of infinite space. So they focus just on the awareness, boundless awareness. So awareness without a boundary, awareness without a particular Focus, it's awareness which is kind of reflecting on its experience of itself, right? Reflecting on the awareness of itself, on the awareness that was space. So when awareness becomes boundless through awareness of space, that means consciousness, then someone who does that, their consciousness has become boundless. Their awareness has become boundaryless. But it still is aware of space. So then can they reflect on the fact that it's aware of space? Can you reflect on the fact that you're aware right now, right? So just as you can reflect on the fact that your body and the materiality is occurring within space, you can also do a reflection, also very commonly taught in some circles, reflect on the fact that things are occurring within your mind, things are occurring within awareness, or that things are within awareness. So again, this is a practice often taught. Maybe you tend to focus on like your thoughts, but sometimes people will tell you like, focus on the field of awareness that the thoughts arise within. And they'll often liken it to space. So it's like space, but it's the space of the mind, right? So think about how if there wasn't any space, you couldn't have any objects, right? So in order to have like a chair, there has to be space for the chair to occupy. In order to enter a room, there has to be space in the room for your body to occupy. In order to even speak, to hear sounds, the sound waves have to travel, right, through space to get you. If there's a wall, a solid brick wall, the sound waves would be blocked. And in order to see, light waves have to travel through space. So anything material, anything physical, it has to have space in order to actually be there. Well, anything mental, anything experienced, there has to be awareness. So you can focus on the objects, or you can focus on the space. You can allow your mind to sink to a more ground level of space. Now, similarly, you can focus on the perception, either of materiality or of space, of anything, or you can focus on the awareness of the perception, right? So that's even more subtle. That's even more base level. Just the knowing. And again, there is a attainment which some people, very few, very select individuals might attain, the attainment of the dimension of infinite consciousness. But again, more likely you will not attain that, not to discourage you, but just I wouldn't get, if it happens, it'll happen naturally. You don't need to, I wouldn't be in a rush because, most people, they're not even going to attain, just trying to practice just a little bit of tranquility and meditation is already, most people are working with that. So this is like really out there. It's hard to stress how advanced this attainment is. So I wouldn't don't even worry about it. But you can focus on the perception of just knowing, right? And if you develop that fully, then you could actually attain the attainment of infinite consciousness. Okay, so that's a more ground level. So you're melting your mind, right? You're kind of purifying your mind. Like imagine you have something and you melt it to purify it. You're purifying like what is the essence of your mind? What is the essence of life? What is the core of everything? So as you drop more and more, you're trying to find like what is the core? You're trying to see, okay, it's empty of this, it's empty of this, it's empty of this. Is there anything which is not empty? Is there anything you can't let go of? Right? If something wasn't empty, or how should I say it? If something is empty, that means you can relinquish it, right? If something is not empty, it's impossible to relinquish it. It means it's always there, right? So think about it like this. If something is not empty, like if something is independently existing, if it's just existing independently, then it means it will always be there. It exists in and of itself. So you will never be able to relinquish it, which is actually quite, terrifying, because that means like it would be inescapable. So like imagine that for example, the perception of infinite space. Let's imagine that was, yourself. Some people might think that, right? They might imagine that that's like the base level of their mind and that is eternal. Their mind is eternal. Everything else is like a mere illusion. But the infinite space, that is eternal. That is their real mind. Well, if you think like that, that means that your mind you would never be able to not go beyond that. That would be like the base level of your mind, and you would never be able to let go of that because it would be existing in and of itself. But if it's empty, if it's dependently originated, if it is circumstantial, if it manifests only when the conditions are present, then the spacious perception of your mind is actually not eternal. It's just a coincidental, circumstantial, conditional appearance. So that means you can let go of it. So that's good. That's good news. That means your mind is not a slave to that thing. Your mind is free of that. It can become free of that. So there's a relationship between like the emptiness of something being conditional and the ability of the mind to relinquish it. If you can let go of something, that means it's empty. That means it's not always there. It's possible to drop it. It's possible for it not to be consistently, eternally present. So you're doing this exercise of finding like what is not eternal, what is not always there. So first, your body, your body can not always be there. You can let go of your body. You can let go of space. You can let go of consciousness. Moving into the next one, someone lets go of consciousness and they meditate on, so they ignore the perception of the dimension of infinite space, and they ignore the perception of the dimension of infinite consciousness. They unhook their mind, focusing on that perception. They unhook it. They let their mind go back a step. And they focus on the oneness dependent on the perception of the dimension of nothingness. Their mind leaps forth, gains confidence, settles down, and becomes decided in that perception of the dimension of nothingness. And they understand that there is no stress there due to the perception of the dimension of infinite space, or due to the perception of the dimension of infinite consciousness. There is only that modicum of stress there, namely the oneness dependent on the perception of the dimension of nothingness. And they understand that that field of perception is empty of the perception of the dimension of infinite space, and it is empty of the perception of the dimension of infinite consciousness. But there is that lack of emptiness, that non-emptiness, namely the oneness dependent on the perception of the dimension of nothingness. And so they regard it as empty of what is not there, but as to what remains, they understand that it is present. That's how emptiness manifests in them, genuine, undistorted, and pure. Okay, so again, repeating the same, and we're getting to a mouthful now, right? The field of perception is empty of the perception of the dimension of infinite space. So that's a sentence. And so hopefully that's not too confusing, but hopefully I've explained it sufficiently so you get what he's saying, right? He's saying that they understand that their field of awareness, what they're perceiving, like the field of their mind, it's empty of that previous perception, right? But it's not empty. It is still full of something. Like something is still present there, right? So again, one way of imagining this is you can imagine your mind is like an onion, and you're peeling back the layers of your mind. And so first you see the outer layer and you peel off the skin and you're like, okay, this is now empty of the skin, but there's still this layer here. So you peel that one back and you're like, oh, wow, that's not the core of this thing. Actually, that can go away. It's empty of that. So now you see another part, and then you peel that one back and you're like, oh, wow, it's empty of that one, but now there's another. So what happens, eventually you get to the onion, right? Well, maybe I should wait now. So we're not there yet. Okay, so then you're almost at the end of the onion. And so now they're perceiving, they're not even focusing on awareness, but they focus on nothingness. Okay, how would one do that, right? Well, one way of doing this is there's actually a sutta where the Buddha says that someone can attain the dimension of nothingness by reflecting on non-self. So why? What is the meaning of that? Well, usually, as I said, in this example of the onion, of like this base level of the mind, like what is always there? What is always present? What is the base? Like we tend to think it's eternally there. It is our true self. It cannot be relinquished. It exists in and of itself. Well, often people think it's awareness. Often they think it's the mind. And you'll even hear this sometimes, even in Buddhist circles, people say like, oh, awareness, blah, blah, blah. Well, awareness is just another conditional thing. It's not eternal. It's not independently existing. So if you reflect on that, then you might actually perceive nothingness. Like your mind might even drop. It won't focus on awareness anymore because it will perceive like, oh, even awareness, even the perception of boundless awareness, like everything occurring within awareness, even that is it's empty. Even that is just a conditional appearance. It's not the true base level of your mind. It's not the true reality. So you can just, at that time, you might even perceive nothingness because there's just nothing, there won't be anything there. There will be no awareness, no objects of awareness. However, it is important to stress that is still there is still awareness there, right? Although you are still actually aware of the perception of nothingness. So this is not the same as the mind being unconscious. So it is a perception of nothingness. It's like you're perceiving it as if there's nothing there. your mind is perceiving nothing, but it's not literal, but there is still the perception of nothing, right? Does that make sense? So if you perceive, like, you might look into an empty room and you say, oh, there's nothing there, but actually you are still perceiving something. You're perceiving nothing there. So in the same way, when you look into your mind and you let go of the perception of awareness, you might perceive like, oh, there's nothing there. Like even the awareness, there's nothing there. But actually, you're still perceiving nothing there. You're still perceiving something. So it's not totally empty, but it is more empty than awareness. It's more empty than that. So this is, you can actually, you can notice though, we're getting even more subtle. So you might have said like, you lost me at space and then you lost me at awareness. And then now we're at nothingness. So that gets more and more rarefied, right? So now the person, it's essentially, you can reflect on the fact that even awareness is not eternally existent. It's not eternally there, but you will still be perceiving. Your mind is still functioning because it hasn't fully let go, right? So remember, at every stage here, your mind might let go. Your mind might just drop, everything. But usually it might go stage by stage. So if you let go of awareness, but you don't fully let go of the mind, you'll still be attaching to the insight that you have, the reflection you have on the awareness being empty. So you'll actually still be perceiving nothingness. Like you'll be attached to the perception of nothingness. So your mind actually will still be attached, but it'll be attached to like a very subtle awareness of the emptiness of awareness. See, so that's like a very advanced state. So if you get there, congratulations. But you're not there yet, right? You're not at the end yet. Okay, then the Buddha says, furthermore, my paraphrasing, they will ignore the perception of the dimension of infinite consciousness, and they even ignore the perception of the dimension of infinite nothingness. So what happens if you even try to let go of that? Can you let go even of that? Can your mind be empty even of nothingness? And so they focus on the oneness. So here we go. The oneness dependent on the perception of the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. Can you repeat that 10 times fast? So focus on the oneness dependent on the perception of the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. So their mind leaps forth, gains confidence, settles down, and becomes decided in that perception of the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. They understand that there, in that perception, there is no stress of the perception of the dimension of the infinite consciousness, of the dimension of infinite consciousness, or the perception of the dimension of nothingness. There is only that modicum of stress, namely the oneness dependent on the perception of the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. They understand that field of perception is empty of the perception of the dimension of infinite consciousness, and it is empty of the perception of the dimension of nothingness. There is only that lack of emptiness, namely the oneness dependent on the perception of the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. So my mind has become like almost numb to the words. And so they regard it as empty of what is not there, but as to what remains, they understand that it's present. That's how emptiness manifests in them, genuine, undistorted, and pure. And so here we get to a point where the sutta actually deserves some explanation. So if you know the list of standard formless attainments, there's 4 of them that the Buddha gives, right? So akasanan chayatanang, vinyanan chayatanang, akinchanyayatanang, and nevasanyanasanyayatanang. So the dimension, the sphere, the field of infinite space, of boundless space, the field of boundless consciousness, the field of nothingness, and then the field of nevasanyana, neither perception nor non-perception. So what does that mean? Well, actually, it should make some sense because we've just talked about it a little bit, right? If your mind is perceiving, it lets go of space, it lets go of awareness, and then it's perceiving nothingness, and then you let go even of that perception, like there's not really any more data to perceive, right? There's nothing left to perceive. You've already perceived nothingness. So, but your mind doesn't totally let go. So your mind is still functioning. Like it's still holding on to something, but it's not even the concept of nothingness. So the Buddha calls it neither perception nor non-perception, meaning like your mind is functioning, but you can't even say like, it's like on a borderline between being aware and being unconscious, because it doesn't even have the content of it is so subtle that you can't even describe. It has no way of describing it. Like, it has no way of verbalizing. It's like your mind is basically in a frozen state. So like before you perceive the concept of nothingness. So you let go even of the perception of awareness, but you're perceiving nothingness. Then you let go even of the nothingness, but your awareness is still functioning. So your mind is just almost frozen in like neither. It's almost unconscious, but it's not. But it's not the same as, like you have a fever or something. You're like, you're almost fainting. It's a deep, aware, still state. It's a state of meditation. It's an intentional state of letting go, but it's like your mind can become so subtle that it doesn't even have like a particular object really that it's taking. It's almost just taking like itself as it's kind of trying to let go of itself, but it can't totally that yet. So it's like kind of frozen in it's almost unconscious, but it is not. So again, that is the most subtle realm of samsara. So the Buddha says, there's one sutta, the Anindasapaya Sutta, where the Buddha is explaining how one can attain the immaterial attainments. And at a certain point in that sutta, Ananda says, it seems, Bhante, he's talking to the Buddha, and he says, it seems, Bhante, that if there is anything that you would grasp onto, if there is anything that you could cling to, if there is anything you could identify as and hold on to and cherish, anything in the whole realm of samsara, anything, the most precious, the most subtle thing, it would be neva sannyana sannyayatana, the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. And the Buddha says, basically, so it is. Yes, it is. That is the most subtle. And elsewhere, the Buddha says that the most, the closest you can get to nirvana while still being in samsara is neva sannyana sannyayatana, the dimension of neither perception or non-perception. It's the least bit of samsara left. You've emptied out almost everything, right? So notice this is emptiness meditation. So you've emptied out almost all of samsara. You've emptied it out, but you have not emptied out this. So this is the most subtle, like the base level. You go down. You're peeling back the onion, peeling back the onion, peeling back the onion. This is the most, like the core of the onion, right? It's like there's no further you can go, really. So that's a very advanced state, and possibly you can also practice in a less advanced state of just perceiving it. Anyway, so then the sutta continues. They ignore that perception and they focus on the oneness dependent on the signless immersion of the heart. So this is called, in Pali, Buddha says, animitta ceto samadhi. So some explanation is warranted here. Well, let me just read through this sutta briefly. It should become clear. So they ignore that perception. They focus on the signless signless immersion of the heart, and they, their mind becomes established in that and understand that it doesn't have the stress of neither perception or non-perception, but there's still the modicum of stress, namely that related to the 6 sense fields dependent on the body and conditioned by life. And so they understand that it's empty of everything before, but it still has the 6 sense fields dependent on the body and conditioned by life. And then it says, furthermore, they ignore the perception of the dimension of nothingness. They ignore the perception of neither perception or non-perception, and they focus on the oneness dependent on the signless immersion of the heart. Their mind leaps forth, gains confidence, settles down, and becomes decided in that signless immersion of the heart. They understand that even that signless immersion of the heart is produced by choices and intentions, blah, blah, blah. So I'm repeating it quickly because the point is that the sutta says it twice. So it goes from neither perception or non-perception to signless, and then it says again, they ignore that and go to signless. So in the parallel to this, like the Chinese parallels, it actually doesn't have this. So it seems to be an editing error. It seems to be that the sutta, because these are formulas, right? Notice that the paragraph is exactly the same every single time, and they just change out the details. So this helps when you're memorizing, because if you memorize the sutta and you recite it, you just remember like the core, and you just change out the formulas. So like if you memorize the list of formless attainments, so like, okay, akasanan chaitanang, vinyanan chaitanang, akinchanyaitanang, nevasanyana sanchaitanang. So nevasanyana sanyaitanang. So you memorize that list and you memorize the formula, that the Buddha gives, which repeats itself again and again through the sutta, you just fill in the list that you have of the formless attainments, you just fill it in with the list of the sutta. And there you go. Now you have basically the whole sutta has been filled out. So when you're memorizing, it becomes very easy. So because it just, it's so formulaic, it's so repetitive. So it becomes like putting together Legos or something, like you just kind of put them together. So it's very easy for editing errors to arise, because normally the list would go 4, right? But in this sutta, it actually kind of stops, right? And it changes to another one. So based off the Chinese parallels and so on, and then and other factors, it seems that probably this is just an editing error, and it should be the signless, the signless one should be after nothingness. Actually, in the parallel, it comes after nothingness, and it's kind of a long story. We actually are almost out of time, so I don't know if I have time to talk about that. But elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha says that basically neither perception nor non-perception, it's so subtle, the mind is so still that you can't really develop insight based off that, because it's so there's so little there. So you can't really reflect on it. So when the Buddha elsewhere, he says like you can attain any of the attainments from the first jhana all the way up to dimension of nothingness. And then later on, you reflect on that as impermanent, as non-self, as suffering, as conditioned, as dependently originated. But neither perception or non-perception, he basically says that it's not really possible to do that, because the mind is so still that there's not really any data to actually reflect on. So in the parallel, it goes from nothingness to signless, and that seems more realistic, right? Because it kind of coincides with what elsewhere the Buddha says, that you can't really reflect on either perception or non-perception. And it coincides with this double kind of this repeating in the sutta, like there's been like a typo almost type of thing, like an oral typo. So anyway, they go to the signless immersion. And okay, what do we do? Well, we're almost out of time. We can read it quickly and then we discuss it later. So they reflect, even that signless immersion of heart is produced by choices and intentions. So even that is fabricated. And they understand, but whatever is produced by choices and intentions, whatever the mind has created, concocted, constructed, intended, is impermanent and liable to cessation. Knowing and seeing like that, their mind is freed from the defilements of sensuality, desire to be reborn, and ignorance. When they're freed, they know they're freed. And they understand that their rebirth has ended, that they've lived the spiritual journey, that what they had to do has been done, and that there's nothing further for that place. And they understand that there is no stress due to the defilements of sensuality, desire to be reborn, or ignorance there in their mind. And there's only that modicum of stress, namely that related to the 6 sense fields dependent on the body and conditioned by life. So when their mind has become awakened, their mind is completely empty of all defilements. They no longer grasp onto any characteristics whatsoever. Their mind is completely empty. It doesn't have any fixed nature. But still, they have this sense, their body still functions. They have the senses in their body. So they understand that the only stress left, the only suffering left, is the residual karma of their body, which still exists. Their mind and their body still existing. But they're not bothered by it. But they understand that, that's all that they have left. And their field of perception is empty of the defilements. So you might think, it still perceives characteristics, but it no longer attaches to any of them. So the mind has no fixed base level, no fixed nature. So their mind is completely empty of all defilements, but it still perceives the senses in the body. So that's the supreme emptiness. And then the Buddha, at the end of the sutta, he says, whatever ascetics and Brahmins enter and remain in the pure, ultimate, supreme emptiness, whether in the past, future, or present, all of them enter and remain in this same pure, ultimate, supreme emptiness, the one he's talking about. So, Ananda, you should train like this. We shall enter and remain in the pure, ultimate, supreme emptiness. That's how you should train. This is what the Buddha said. Satisfied, Venerable Ananda approved what the Buddha said. And that's the end of our sutta. I know I rushed through the end, but I hope that it was relatively clear, and we can go over it in the next live stream. So this time we can pay respects to this discourse with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I hope you have a wonderful morning. Have a good day. And we will see you for our Friday evening monk chat if you are watching in. So have a good day.